the program for change is a program that Frank and Jack cooked up. What do you think of it, Keith? I mean, you primarily work through the legislature system rather than, or you've worked through all the systems, but you gave up on some of the unions that you were working on.
Well, I endorse the program for change, but I think my goal is to try to soften people up so they might want to accept it and actually work on it. I would hope that the ultimate goal, whether we do it gradually or all at once, it's kind of like taking down the Berlin Wall. We could take it down brick by brick, but magically it came down all at one time. And the reason it came down was the ideology disappeared. The ideology supporting communism in East Berlin led to people to take to the streets and take it down. So we're all working toward the same goal, and I think that's what's imperative. And in terms of my giving up, I haven't given up on anything. I'm just realizing that early on in my life, you run into walls. And there's several things you can do with walls. One is you can try to keep going through them, bang your head against them. The other is you can find a way to take them down. You can jump over them, or you can go around them, or you can turn around and go in a different direction. I decided not to bang my head against the same wall, and I'm going in different directions. But the goal, the purpose is to get to a goal. If there's an obstacle in your path, you have to overcome it. And we as contingent faculty, we have obstacles, and we haven't chosen them, but we've chosen to try to go around them. That's what we're doing.
I like your analogy of the Berlin Wall too, because when it started, those first few bricks came out, and it did really crumble pretty quickly. So, and you said you were an immediate too, right? So that hopefully the change happens kind of like it did, exactly with the Berlin Wall in terms of change that really needs to happen quickly, right? And it should, and it's not going to happen overnight. But so much of it is so logical and rational, and the justice there is so omnipresent that it really, we have those things that we can rely on. This is not rocket science. It's there's simple, pretty basic elements of justice there that we can rely on. I think that we have in our back pocket that will eventually make this happen, perhaps quicker than we think it can.
Well, I think before there's a revolution, you have to have an ideology. You have to change the ideology and propose an alternative to it. And that takes time. It may seem like the revolution happens overnight, but something's been happening for a long time.
Well, the groundwork has been laid a lot before that, yeah.
In Russia, it was perestroika, so that was one example. He was basically laying the groundwork for a different approach, and he deserves credit for that at least. So the anecdote I wanted to tell you was to share with you, since you're doing research on this topic, is in 2014 my book was published, Equality for Contingent Faculty. Now, normally when a book is published by a faculty member, the college wants to publicize it. The college wants to promote it and say, look, our faculty are publishing, great stuff. And my community college was going toward being a college at the time, so this is a nice thing when your faculty publish. So the college puts out a staff and faculty newsletter for all the employees. And one of the new reporters for it got hold of my book, read it, loved it, thought it was fantastic, called me in, did an interview, said in the next issue, I'm going to do this fantastic review of your book for everybody to see what it is. And I said, great. Next issue came out. It wasn't in there. So I called her up and said, what happened? She said, my editor spiked it. And I said, why? It's just a review of a book published by a faculty member. And she said, you'll have to talk to her. So I went and talked to her boss, and her boss said, it wasn't her decision, it came from the president of the college. The president of the college didn't want the publicity for my book to go out. So I filed a grievance over this, and the college responded and said that there's a prohibition in our state for using public resources for private gain. And if we were to, we would be advertising your book, and you would be selling copies, and you'd be making private gain, so it would be unethical for us to mention your book in our newsletter.
That was their pretext? Yeah.
Yes. So I emailed the head of our state ethics board, and I said, would this be unethical? And she emailed me back and said, no. Unless they're trying to, have coupons for your book or sell your book, just announcing the book is not unethical, and it's considered a proper thing for a college to do. And I also got a letter, I think, from the American Association of University Professors that said, this is ridiculous. You shouldn't be doing this. And so this is one of the few grievances I ever won. But what happened was, instead of getting a whole story about my book, they had me buried, and had one paragraph buried between two tenured faculty who had third and fourth editions of their books come out, which is a different thing than a brand new book coming out.
Yeah.
Okay? And so I got one paragraph in it, and that was it. But the administration was threatened by the ideas in the book. They didn't want the publicity, since it was advertised in the jacket of the book that I taught at the college. I don't think they wanted that publicity out. And so you ran into the same problem trying to get data on contingent faculty in Canada.
Absolutely, yeah. As soon as you said that, it reminded me of the pushback that I received from universities when I was trying to get some of the data on contract faculty. How many of these employees were the universities hiring in relation to the tenure stream and so on. Almost a remarkable degree of pushback in some cases, almost surprising. Maybe it shouldn't be surprising, but it was a little bit surprising. And their claims in the past had always been things like they were unable to collect this data. It was too difficult for them, or Stats Canada should be doing it, or somebody else. But what I found when it came right down to it is they could do it because they used the Freedom of Information laws in Ontario, and that they weren't doing it. I would say, this does not make them look very good. They were worried about the kind of publicity this would generate. This, casts some very, very bad light on these institutions. So it's.
Do you think was it neglect, or was it by design? Do you think that they're not collecting and not sharing that information?
Well, in the past, that's what they had claimed. They couldn't do it for whatever reason. It was these people have campus cards, they have social insurance numbers, but for whatever reason, they couldn't make it happen. They couldn't collect and release it. Now, again, history set up a bit of a controlled experiment here, right? Because the Ontario Confederation of University Faculty Associations tried to get this information through informal access to information requests in 2004, before the universities came under the Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Act. I filed mine after this happened, and I received data from almost every institution after. It was a struggle, but I did. So their claims in the past that this wasn't possible and so on and so forth were pretty disingenuous, obviously.
So you've both used the laws to help advance equality, really, in the long run for faculty, faculty of all kinds, right? And you've had to use the law, right?
Yes.
Because essentially these organizations, these public institutions, in Canada's case, almost all of our colleges and universities are publicly funded. They're heavy taxpayer money is going into them, and yet they're blocking. They're disobeying fundamental laws and fundamental principles of equality, right?
Principles of higher education, the university, is knowledge commons, right? They're supposed to be big part of these institutions.
Well, they told me it was a community of scholars when I was in
that too.
My seminar when I was in way back in the early 70s when my Shakespeare prof, we sat around and discussed Shakespeare, about 12 or 15 of us, and he said, we're part of a community of scholars, we're here to exchange ideas, and it was wonderful.
Free and open interchange.
It doesn't seem to have become that. If it ever was, it certainly isn't.
Well, I think,
that.
yeah, and along with the corporatization of the university, more broadly, you have a lot more administrative secrecy, a lot more centralization, that sort of thing. Which it's one aspect of corporatization. That's actually related very much to this one, but
it relates to bargaining and to talking to the administration and to one another about the issues. And everybody wants facts. Certainly, the other side. When I've been in bargaining with the university administration, they always say we want to base this on data and facts and hard things, not just hearsay, not just anecdotal information, not just emotional stuff. we want to deal with reality, right? But they won't give us that information, right? We've had so much trouble, all of the faculty associations, unions, whatever, have a great deal of trouble actually finding how many of us are there. What are the percentages? All of those things which seem to be essential to knowing who we're serving. Have you run into that problem too, Keith?
Well, we've been lucky in the United States that we have access to that data.
Yeah.
And in my book at the back, there's an appendix from the AAUP that documents the changes. And I also did it in Washington State. We have a state board which oversees the community colleges, and so they've kept the data. And so what you find out is that, in the past several decades, the number of tenure track faculty has increased by maybe 10%. But the number of adjuncts, part-time faculty, has increased by 300%. And you can pretty much document it. Probably the 73 Arab oil embargo is a good date. Prior to that, there was a shortage of full-time tenure track faculty in America. There was a book called The Mobile Professors by David Brown that basically said, here's what you need to do to keep and attract your tenured faculty. Give them early promotion, give them raises, all that stuff. That was published in '67. And then, starting after the Arab oil embargo, they were starting to move not to tenured professors, or more of them, or they moved more and more to adjunct faculty as both student enrollment increased and tuition increased. And so tuition in the United States has outpaced inflation for decades. Mm-hmm. And so the big question is, where has that money gone to? Now, the tenured faculty have kept up with inflation, except for a couple years with our recession that happened around 2008. But except for that, they've kept up with inflation. The adjuncts have not. And one of the big secrets is that most adjuncts in America don't get raises at all. And one of the things that I think has led to the disparity in salary is the fact that the full-time faculty keep getting raises and the adjuncts don't. And so that means that the disparity keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger each year. And
Which undermines everybody, right? I mean, it undermines the bargaining position of the full-time people, because if I'm a university administrator and you come to me as a full-timer and say, we want more research funds or whatever, I could say, look, I can replace you easily with somebody who comes a lot cheaper, right? So the greater that disparity, it undermines the bargaining position of those at the top as well as those at the bottom, right?
Yeah, really threatens the long-term interests of the entire faculty.
It threatens everybody.
Yes.
That inequality really diminishes the institutions we're working in. Yeah.
Gerry, we just have to, you can stay and absolutely finish up. Just lock up the door when you leave.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Do you want to ride still?
We'll be maybe 5 more minutes.
I'll just wait.
10.
Lock up.
Okay.
We won't
All right.
One of the things that struck me in comparison from Canada to the United States is, contract faculty in Canada are paid very poorly. It does vary between provinces, and there are actually some significant variations. But you always forget when you look down to the United States, the salaries are much less. Right across the country, they're in fact quite abysmal. And you talk about people living on poverty level wages here. It's much less so here than it is in the United States. And so sometimes I think we do have it bad here, but boy, adjuncts in the U.S. When you look at just wages and of course things like benefits and all kind of lack of pensions and so on, do have it significantly worse, and that's right across the country as far as I can tell.
Yeah, is it that things are worse, or is it that there's greater extremes at both ends, right? So you have adjuncts on food stamps in many places in the U.S., so and here they're just kind of poor. We don't,
right?
They're not on welfare; they're just having a really hard time.
Well, for one thing, you have universal health care, which we
makes a huge difference, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
So that makes a big difference.
Yeah.
I sense also you have a stronger labor movement. Frank Costco of Vancouver Community College often says he's a unionist first and an academic second. Well, in the States, they're academics first and unionists either second or third or fourth. And our union movement has been in trouble for a very long time. And the union people will often point to very real attacks that come from conservatives and people who are opposed to unions. But it's still the case that our union leaders have not found a way to counter those attacks. And so every time they do a survey, they find fewer and fewer people belong to unions. Unions are doing less and less. They're not striking anymore. They're not getting wage gains. They're not increasing job security.
Was it down to in the United States, 10, 11% unionization?
It's under 11%. My guess is it'll be under 10. And if it ends up with the Supreme Court ruling against what they call agency shop, where all the workers have to either become a member and pay dues or pay a representation fee, without that incentive, I think a lot of people will not be members of the unions as a result. The unions are fighting that, but the Supreme Court is now majority conservative with the recent Trump pick of Neil Gorsuch. So it's likely that they're going to continue to decrease. But they still haven't found a way to counter much of the negative attitude that people have about unions. And when I tell people my conditions, they say, "You need a union." I go, "My union? I do have a union. My union's my problem."
Yeah.
So your union hasn't been serving the adjuncts, really.
No, it gives lip service, and if we protest enough, they will handpick a union. I haven't figured out a good name for these people. I've come up with the best I come up with is they pick symbiotes, and a symbiote, in my view, is an adjunct who really sides with the tenured faculty and with the union leaders, and they put them on the bargaining teams, and they end up justifying why they didn't get anything for the adjuncts. In the meantime, they got something good for the tenured faculty new. I'll never forget a few years ago, a union president announced at a union meeting that they just got one personal day of leave every quarter for the faculty. And I said, "That's great, because all I have is sick leave, and I'm not sick, so if I don't know what to do, I have to lose money." Okay? And the president said, "Oh, no. The personal day only applies to the tenured faculty. You still don't have any personal days."
Right. Yeah.
And so it took I think 10 years and later, and they finally bargained personal days for the adjuncts and touted it as a wonderful thing, although the tenured faculty had had it for a decade.
The contract at my last university is very similar. Actually, the last two universities I taught at, very similar. Huge differences. At one university where I taught for 19 years, the overall contract was a huge thing, right? It was like a Bible almost, right? There were so many clauses in it protecting this and that. And the sessional contract was 1/2 a page.
Yes, right.
That was it.
Yeah.
Right.
Nothing.
What do we get?
Couple lines.
This is how much you get for doing a course, which was terrible, one of the lowest in Canada. And the next line was, what happens if we die while we're teaching a class? We get, our family gets $300 or something. So jackpot, right? All I have to do is die now, right?
Green River College has a union contract that's 100 pages long. And there's about 5 pages dealing with adjunct issues. And it uses the term faculty throughout. And what happens is both the union and the college go, "Well, the word faculty doesn't apply to part-time faculty. You're not really faculty." And it's absolutely appalling. And so we have just this small section, and mostly what the section says, it treats us differently, and it basically says that you can't get tenure. And you can't get tenure, you can't get tenure, you can't get tenure. And that's why they have these caps on our workloads, because if we're working full-time, we would qualify for tenure under the tenure statute in the law. So the unions agree to deny us a full-time workload so we can't get tenure.
So do you think tenure is a problem?
Tenure is a huge problem.
Okay.
It's a problem, first of all, because we have the tenure haves and the untenured have-nots. So it's the dividing line throughout academia. It's tenure.
Academic apartheid, you called it, right?
I called it faculty apartheid. Others earlier, as early as '83, someone called it academic apartheid. But the point is, a minority of the faculty are controlling and ruling over the majority of the faculty. And that's why I use that term. But it's also apartheid because the tenured faculty are treated so well and bargain so many good things for themselves and don't do that for us. And we are treated in a visibly inferior manner, and on every issue that we can think of. And when we complain about it, we end up often either ignored, or if they take us seriously, we do end up with retaliation. Teresa Knudsen, 20 years ago, founded the Washington Part-Time Faculty Association with me. And in 2005, we published an op-ed in her newspaper, the Spokesman Review newspaper in Spokane, Washington. And it was called Colleges Exploit Part-Time Professors. Within 2 weeks, the chair of her English department, who had total control over her, called her in and said, "You're an employee of Spokane Community College. You have no right to criticize the college in the paper. And I want you
No
to
academic freedom.
No, and I want you to resign." And she said, "I have free speech. I won't do it." And within a matter of 2 weeks, she was fired. So she tried to grieve it and found out what all adjuncts find out. The union contracts do not allow you to grieve your being fired because you are a temporary person.
Temporary person.
And you have no due process rights whatsoever. That's why I said what the colleges in the U.S. have done is they followed a pattern of tenure or nothing. If you have tenure, you've got academic freedom, you've got job security, you've got good salaries. If you don't have tenure, you have nothing. And they're not working on any kind of new job security for the contingent faculty.
What's your take on that, Jimmy? I mean,
Well, I would just speak to something that Keith just said about recognizing adjuncts in the U.S., contract faculty here as faculty. It's something I discovered by chance, actually, when I was sending out my Freedom of Information requests, that made the mistake of putting in faculty, the word faculty, in the contract faculty, so on and so forth. Some of them didn't even understand what the heck I was talking about. These are people who aren't faculty. What are you talking about? And I would get lectures literally from human resource personnel, from administrators saying, that's not how universities work. We have a faculty, a stable core group of full-time faculty, and then we have part-time instructors. That's what we have here. So your information requests don't make sense. You better change them. And that was a immediate wake-up call, and it taught me a lot. Going through that process and just seeing how administrators react, not just even getting the data, but the process was.
So faculty implies status of a sort. It implies difference.
It implies a real employee,
Right.
not this
Real
temp agency employees that we bring on to fill in the slots that we need. Well, the slots are now half or whatever it is, right? So it's outrageous.
So do you think the tenure system in itself is a problem? What's your take on that, Jimmy?
I really haven't looked into it enough. I mean, I threw that out today. I said, the proposals of Kerry and others, in the U.S. that I don't know if it's tenure per se. I said something like because what I was speaking to was job security, because it was an issue I raised earlier, and just and academic freedom, whether tenure as we know it, and Keith made a lot of good points about that. It's not tenure is not going to solve that problem, but some kind of meaningful regularization that they actually talked about. Of course, in the past with Vancouver Community College, that kind of model, and it was laid out very well in terms of what is needed and what cannot happen if we want to make that happen. So, some kind of regularization, job security that's meaningful and that actually it works in practice. Whether that's tenure or not, whether you want to call it tenure, call it something else, that's a different story, I think.
In a way, what we need is pretty similar to what workers need anywhere, right? It's some degree of job security.
To avoid precarity.
It's an ability to pay the basic bills and the freedom of speech, right? Which is particularly important in the academic setting, right? Because we have to talk about all sorts of subjects, and we have to be able to do it freely, right? And we have to be able to help improve our own institutions by being able to speak candidly and openly about
it. We do, although Keith made a very good point. Tenure doesn't mean tenured radicals, right? And that's been true for intellectuals and academics forever. It generally means tenured liberals who, most of them don't need the protections of academic freedom because they never have anything provocative to say. And I don't want to generalize too much on that, but it's largely true. But there are a class of academics and intellectuals who do need those protections, could use them, and have faced severe reprisals when they don't have them. So, and even if they do have them, they could, tenure is no guarantee of being arbitrarily dismissed or dismissed for, reasons of administrative retribution. So
Those on the tenure track don't have academic freedom. They're often told, do not rock the boat. Do not criticize anyone
The tenure
if
track,
you want to
yeah.
get tenure.
Right.
So
Right.
Supposedly you can't rock the boat when you're a graduate student because you're dependent on your dissertation director. You can't rock the boat when you're on the tenure track. So you're talking about a long period of time, maybe 10 years on average, to getting your PhD. And then, lo and behold, once you get tenure, you're now free to say whatever you want. Except it turns out that if tenured faculty get into political hot water, they get fired anyway. And so what Frank Donahue did in his book, The Last Professors, is he went back and looked at the origin of the American Association of University Professors in 1915, and they had a declaration, and then it was changed in 1940, and it was watered down to meet the approval, because it was co-authored by the American Association of Colleges and Universities. And so they were the ones, along with the AP, that agreed on the 7-year probation period. And they narrowed down academic freedom to basically be talking in your field of specialization. Whereas originally the AUP thought anything you talk about outside of the classroom
As a public intellectual.
you were free to do. But now it was very narrow as to what your protections were. And I think that tenure has become a protection for the job. I don't think it's still a protection for free speech.
And why is academic freedom so important in colleges and universities? I mean, this film is for the general public. Why should they care about that?
Well, I teach critical thinking, and I tell my students the most important component of critical thinking is courage. Because to be a critical thinker is to delve into things that go against the norm, against what's accepted, against the grain. And you're going to run into resistance. And so you have to have courage. And so whether you're in the sciences and you're questioning a particular theory in the sciences, whether you're in philosophy and you're debating something controversial like abortion or euthanasia, you're likely to raise issues and have people have passions. And you ought to be able to do that, you're a professional, without fear that you're going to lose your job. And the fundamental kind of job security people need is that they can only lose their job through due process rights, and that they can grieve it, and they can get an independent body to look at it. And if you don't have that, then you don't have any meaningful types of job security. That's why I mentioned in my talk that the union contracts don't have any kind of protection. You can't grieve being fired if you are a contingent faculty member. You can't file a grievance, you can't do anything.
Right. What do you have any comments on academic freedom? I mean, is it important to the students? Does it make a difference to them if I can't speak my mind on something?
Well, absolutely, and this goes back to the whole question of job security. I mean, what you're seeing in the United States, it's actually been pretty well documented. In Frank Donahue's book, I think he wrote some things about that, and that is what we're seeing more and more in Canada and the United States is self-censorship, right, on the part of professors. They don't feel they can take risks in the classroom. They don't feel they can speak out on important public issues, in part because they're fearful. They're fearful of losing their job. They're fearful of creating controversy in the classroom, which ultimately gives them bad evaluations, which means they might not get the next contract. They're fearful of administrative reprisal in some cases. If they're really persistent and or if they generate controversy at some kind of political level or something. I mean, they can face real consequences. And if you don't have those protections for these people in the form of academic freedom, then the universities, colleges, they're diminished institutions because you don't have the free exchange of ideas. You don't have you have scared professors who aren't challenging their students, as Keith said. He teaches critical thinking. Well, try doing that without being a little bit controversial here, there, or everywhere, right? And that's so I think self-censorship of thousands of adjuncts and contract faculty. It's kind of a silent self-censorship. Is really, I think it's changing the nature of these institutions. I think it's cancerous to these institutions, and they're not the same institutions when half, 3/4 of their faculty don't have protections from of this kind.
What does that mean for the kind of society we're building?
It means it's going to be diminished.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
What's interesting is everybody agrees that college professors deserve and have academic freedom. When the controversy arises at Berkeley with Ann Coulter, the president of the university said very clearly, yeah, we have academic freedom, we believe in it, and you're supposed to have it whether you have tenure or not, and the students have it too.
That's right.
But the problem is there's no way, if you don't have tenure, there's no way to enforce it, there's no way to protect it. And that's why I've suggested over and over again that simply tenure being the only means to protect academic freedom means that at least 3/4 of the faculty in the U.S. don't have academic freedom because they have no protections for it. And so therefore we need to start developing other ways of protecting academic freedom. And it has to be across the board. And probably some kind of job security is going to be important of that. But the other problem is that in America, where by and large the adjuncts and the continuing faculty are forced into unions that are basically run by their managers, by their supervisors. In 1980, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling called the Yeshiva decision about Yeshiva University in New York State. And essentially what it ruled was that tenure track faculty were managers or supervisors and not entitled to a union under federal law. And that has been the law of the land since 1980. Now, the unions and the tenure faculty don't like that because of the corporatization. They think we've lost power. We don't have power in the university. The fact that we have faculty senates is meaningless. Okay, we can argue about that, but there is no argument, I think, that in most cases the tenured faculty are the supervisors of the adjuncts and the contingent faculty. They assign us courses, they interview us, they decide whether to have us back, they evaluate us, they observe us. The administrators have almost nothing to do with us. And so essentially, the unions and the colleges together have decided the tenured faculty will be our supervisors. And there's fundamental labor law in the U.S. You cannot have supervisors in the same union because then they become company unions. They're run by management. They're faux unions. Faux unions. And so for a large part, what we've got in America are fake unions for the adjuncts.
We have those in Canada too. Our faculty associations. I mean, I've sat on bargaining committees, and my teammates on my side bargaining for faculty and sessionals. In fact, adjunct faculty were chairs of departments, and they were hiring and firing sessionals, right?
Yes.
So it's. I mean,
Yeah, hiring and firing, or just taking, which is in effect firing.
deciding
Full
to
professor
renew-
wants to teach that course.
Yeah.
It's a course that a contract instructor's taught for 5 or 6 years. I want it. Okay, bye. That's an effective fire, right? It's not really firing the person, but in effect, that's exactly what it is.
Yeah,
and that's
because
on
when
a
you're
whim of another person.
Yeah, when you're on a short-term contract, they can decide whether to renew that contract or not at any point, or whether to give you
Often,
an extra
yeah.
course or not, and that's the problem we all have, yeah.
Jack Longmate raised the issue of equal pay and pointed out, I've argued for equal pay for equal work for years. So what happened was the unions and the tenured faculty started to say, but you don't do equal work, so you don't deserve equal pay, so you're asking for money you don't deserve. And I said, what are you talking about? And they said, well, you don't do things like develop courses, and full-timers do. And I said, I've developed several courses. And it turns out at my college, I did develop several courses, but the union contract didn't allow me to do it. So a tenured faculty signed it. The new course proposal was signed by a tenured faculty member.
So it says you don't do it, but you actually do it.
Actually do
Yeah,
it.
okay.
And some of us serve on committees that we're not supposed to publish. So I've published about 12 books. Okay, so yeah, we do that as well, but we just don't get support for it, and we don't get credit for it. And now in the community colleges, there's no research component. So by and large, what the full-time faculty do differently is they serve on committees. Well, I could fall asleep in a faculty committee as well as any tenured faculty member. That's something I kind of inborn, very simple, So I don't see, but they deny us formally deny us stuff, which we do anyway, and then say, because we've denied you that, you don't deserve to be paid for it.
Because you don't do it, but you do it.
Yeah.
So, I know you guys have to eat dinner. What do you see as the way forward, at least in Canada, for contract faculty? Are there a couple of key steps that we need to take? You know, what's the essence of what we need to do? It's a hard
It's been a
one.
long day. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, getting the word out is important. The public, it's interesting. There was a survey, Ontario survey, not too long ago, and they asked members of the public, do you think, it was something to the effect, do you think that contract faculty should get pay? I don't know if it was equal pay for equal work. It was something like that, though. Should they receive the same rights and treatment and be offered the same benefits and so on as full-time faculty? Huge majority said yes. Yes, that makes sense to us, yes. And then another huge majority said something to the effect of, but they already do. We think they're not aware of the situation, but if they were aware of the situation, they'd be very much in our favor. And that's something I see, researching corporatization more broadly, on almost every measure, the public is opposed to the way our colleges and universities are being restructured. You take, research. The majority of the population believes that professors should be in control of research agendas and research contracts, and not universities, not corporations. Corporate university research partnerships should. They don't trust governments. They don't trust corporations or university administrators on that. They're sharply opposed to public funding cuts, which have been going on for a long time. Almost every measure. They're sharply opposed to. They say the best way to compensate for public funding cuts is to cut the administration. It's exactly the opposite. Is what happened. They've been growing beyond belief. They're paying themselves incredible amounts of money. So almost every measure, the public is sharply opposed to corporatization.
So we need to talk to them more. We need to get them on side.
Well, I think it's a tremendous ally, tremendous potential ally. Huge potential ally. They're called the public, the Canadian public. I assume it's probably the same in the United States. But if they don't know what's going on, and surveys have shown that they're not that aware, and maybe why should they be? If we're not getting the word out, that's on us, I guess.
What do you see as the way forward, Keith?
Well, we have to go to the public. That's first of all. We have to go to our legislators and to our politicians. We also have to start taking on our unions. And that's a hard task in America because our unions have not just failed the adjuncts, they've failed other workers as well. They've been doing that for a long time. And part of that problem, of course, is with our politician problem is that the unions and the Democrats have been in bed together for a long time, even though they've yet to produce a single live living offspring. That's a barren marriage, as one person, Mike Davis, has said. So we have a big task to do, but my gosh, if saving higher education in America and in Canada isn't something worth fighting for, what is? We're talking about, as it is now, I figure probably 10 million college professors, people that got masters and PhDs and went into college teaching, have had their lives just destroyed by this contingency. Okay? People who didn't write their books, who didn't do their research, who didn't have children, who didn't get married, who weren't able to buy cars. Okay? And why? Okay? So we've been basically doing the opposite of what we did after World War II, which is build up our colleges and universities. And we've been tearing them down. A good friend of mine, Ron Swift, an adjunct that taught for 50 years at Green River College, never got a full-time job. Distinguished communications professor. And he said what's happened with college and universities is something he has labeled inside outsourcing. Just as with NAFTA and World Trade, they outsource jobs. They've done it by actually hiring contingents on the campuses, and it's not aware to people what's been happening, and so they don't put us in the college catalogs. Our names are not there. We're 3/4 of the faculty, and we're not there. Okay, they don't want to advertise, as you found out, how many they've got.
That's right.
Okay, they don't want to do that, and so we have a big task ahead of us. But what we're literally doing is fighting for, the words of a book that another author wrote, the soul of higher education. And we're fighting for the kind of democracy that which we want to have as well.
Ellen Schrecker's book.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's absolutely imperative that we take it up. And the first thing we have to do is tell people about it. And as with any kind of publicity, we have to tell them over and over and over again until it finally gets out. You know, I was looking at the mission of Okanagan College. It's up here on the wall. And when it comes to their own contingent faculty, they're violating it. Okay? I talked to a janitor here at Okanagan College, and he's appalled at how the contingent faculty are treated here. It's absolutely appalled. He has it better than the contingent faculty do. And of course, as you know, most janitors would like to get more education and aspire to be a college professor. People still have the idea that college professors have got little tweedy suits around and driving Porsches and Saabs and things like that, Volvos, and have big offices filled with books, you know.
And what did the janitor say to you? He said, "That's terrible. Your employment situation is absolutely awful. I feel sorry for you," right? I mean, that's
Well,
that's the
I haven't
situation.
found anybody in the public that doesn't say this is wrong.
Right.
I hide that to my student.
That's right.
Most people would say, you know, it's like if your doctor is a brain surgeon. Do you want an adjunct brain surgeon?
A temp.
Okay, all right, you know, oh, I just do this on the weekends, you know, I just come in, which, by the way, is another myth, which is that this college presidents, they did this with you, they do it in our state, and which is that, oh, we're just hiring an auto mechanic to teach auto mechanics in the evening, one class a year.
Right.
And that may have been true in the 60s when the community colleges got started. That hasn't been true for decades now. And so you've got English departments that are not hiring auto mechanics to teach English. And they've got dozens and dozens of people who are trying to make it. I've also heard tenured faculty and union leaders say, well, you're an adjunct. Well, you shouldn't be trying to make a living at being an adjunct. It's pretty clear that that's suicidal and a waste of time. I said, we're all trying to make a living at it. We spent all these years getting our PhDs and our master's degrees. Why wouldn't we want to make a living? That's what we did. We went into debt with student loans for that purpose. So of course that's what we're.
And after such a commitment like that, it's much less likely that you're just going to say, "Okay, I'll abandon this," and you're right, this is crap. So let's get out of
So
here. After years and years and years,
we're on the merry-go-round trying to grab that brass ring of tenure. That's what we're trying
and
to
get away
do.
from that. Yeah, that's
And it isn't happening. And so, luckily, people are realizing now that they're not going to get that brass ring. And so their option is to try to change things for themselves. We've done that in Washington State, and I'm sad to say the unions have opposed us in almost everything. But we still succeeded. And I think it's something that we just simply have to do. And I think that publicity works. I've published a number of op-eds, and the op-ed editors like them. The public responds to them very positively. And so, but then the politicians, you get different dynamics when you go there. And that's something that we have to change. I mean, it has to change in general, given our political climate. And I think it will. But I think that for the moment, the pond that I'm swimming in is this pond filled with adjuncts. And we're trying to get out of the pond and onto the shore because some of us are drowning. And we've had adjunct suicides. And we've had Mary Voitko who died as well. By the way, she taught at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, which is where I got my master's in psychology. And I got that in 1972. There were no adjuncts at Duquesne University in 1972. It's a Catholic university with supposedly Catholic values. And apparently it doesn't have the Catholic value of trying to save the lives of its employees by giving them health care.
Wow. Anything that we haven't talked about? I know that there's so much more we could go into, but I don't want to keep you from your dinners. I'm going to try to come and see you in Ottawa, I think.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
What is there any final comments you want to say for the general public?
Maybe you would do that in Ottawa. No, I don't.
Okay.
I'm completely fried.
Keith.
I think I've pretty much said it. I think that we have to recognize this is wrong.
Yeah.
And we have to recognize that it affects all aspects of higher education. You know, it used to be that being a professor was a valued profession, that people would look up to you. And you might not be rich, you might not be as rich as a stock trader, but you would have a nice, comfortable life. You'd be able to buy a house. You'd be able to pay off your student loans. And there was a reason for that, because we thought that college professors ought to have the time to spend with their students, to prepare lectures, okay, to do research. All these contingents are doing all that, but they're not being paid for it. They're doing it on their own time. And so that's why I think the two words that were put up on the door, in which I wrote an op-ed about, applies, and it's called wage theft. And the colleges and universities have created sweatshops throughout the land and are engaged in the vile practice of stealing money from their employees. And there ought to be a law against it, or at least we ought to take the laws we have and we ought to start applying them.
Okay. Thank you, gentlemen. Excellent. Thank you, gentlemen. Let's eat.
Thanks so much.
Yeah, you too.
Appreciate it.
That's nice.
You guys.